Guhl here, and today for my second art assignment, I'm going to be talking about the opera in Sevilla. And so for a little bit of context, there are more than 150 operas that are set in Sevilla, and so I wanted to discuss some of the more prominent works that are set there, and then begin to explain perhaps why it drew in so many different operas. So here we have a picture of the tobacco factory in Sevilla, and this is important because during really from the 12th to 16th century, Sevilla was a huge powerhouse in trade. It was a leading producer of weapons and tobacco, and so it was kind of developed into this icon of European society. There were a lot of people that immigrated to Sevilla. There was a lot of international influences from all of their trading, and this drew in a lot of artists. And I personally believe this is why there are so many operas set there. So the first composer that I wanted to talk about is Mozart. He is perhaps the most famous classical composer of all time, and he has two major operas that are set in Sevilla. So he actually visited Sevilla, and after he came back, he wrote two operas, both set in Sevilla, back to back. The first one is The Marriage of Figaro, and the second being Don Giovanni. And so the Don Giovanni is pretty significant because a lot of people speculate that it's about Mozart's relationship with his father, and yet he still decided that it should be set in Sevilla instead of Austria. These are two of his most famous operas. They feature some of the more prominent areas of Sevilla. There's Plaza Downtown, which has a balcony that is supposed to be featured in The Marriage of Figaro. And it just shows that clearly this had an impact on him or his trip had an impact on him since he decided to write two operas both set in Sevilla. The next composer that I want to talk about is Beethoven, who is famous. He has a very famous opera, Fidelio, because it was the only opera that he ever wrote. He wrote a lot of sonatas and instrumental pieces, but he didn't really write very many vocal pieces. And so Fidelio is instantly famous just because it is the only opera that Beethoven ever wrote, and it's a pretty good one. It was called a rescue opera, which was kind of a subgenre of opera that was really popular in the classic age, and it's about a prisoner who is trying to escape during the Spanish Inquisition or the Spanish Reconquest. And so this is the Castillo de San Jorge, which is connected to Sevilla. It's part of a suburb called Triana, which is across the Guadalquivir River. And so this is a very well preserved castle that was used as kind of a prison and is the set for Beethoven's only opera, Fidelio. Next, we have Rossini. This is our first romantic composer, and he wrote The Barber of Seville. Obviously, this is Sevilla is important because it's in the title of the opera. The Barber of Seville is an opera bouffe, which means that it is kind of a satire, light-hearted comedy that makes fun of society, but also just kind of the art style of opera in general. But it is one of the most famous operas. It's probably the most recognizable opera bouffe, and obviously it's very recognizable that Sevilla is part of it since it's in the title. And so I believe that Sevilla was very strategic for him to use because there was already a foundation of operas being set there. So for that sort of meta humor, it really makes sense that he would choose Seville. He was a composer after Mozart, Beethoven, and countless others had written operas set in Sevilla, and so it makes sense that for an opera bouffe, Sevilla is kind of the perfect location for that. And finally, I wanted to talk about the composer Bizet, and his opera Carmen. I think this is probably the most just generally famous opera that is set in Sevilla. And it's probably the most obvious one that's set in Sevilla because more so than other operas, there are multiple historic locations that are incorporated into the plot. So, for example, I showed a picture of the tobacco factory, and that is where the protagonist Carmen actually works. Here we have the Plaza de Toros, which is an arena for bullfighting. Another one of the characters is a matador, and the Puente Isabel II, which is a famous bridge in Sevilla. And so these are just a couple of places that are included in Carmen, and it was actually based on a Spanish novel. And I think that Carmen does a better job than the other operas of also incorporating Spanish themes into the story. So, lust, envy are both very prominent in this opera, and passion. And so, kind of these characteristic Spanish qualities are also incorporated very well into the story. So, those were just a few of the examples of, I mean, there's 150. There's so much to talk about with opera in Sevilla. And I think that once you go there, you can kind of see why so many people would choose it. I mean, if you walk downtown, you can go from 10 landmarks within 20 minutes or something like that. It has a ton of art and history and culture all concentrated into one beautiful city. And since it was a cultural icon due to its production of weapons and tobacco during the time that these operas were written, it just makes sense that it would be set in Sevilla. I would say that, there's it's kind of the same as, the modern musical Chicago being set in Chicago. When a city rises to prominence, it's going to draw in artistic types and inspire them to write stories. So these were just a few examples that I wanted to outline. There's so much history to be had with opera and Sevilla, but for anybody that is an opera buff or wants to learn more, this is probably the greatest city to go to for that. Thank you. Bye bye.